TITUS by Suetonius. From the 12 Caesars. Edited by Robert Graves. 11. Titus, afterwards deified. Titus, surnamed, like his father, Vespasian, had such winning ways, perhaps inborn, perhaps cultivated subsequently, or conferred on him by fortune, that he became an object of universal love and adoration. Nor was this an easy task, because it happened only after his accession, both as a private citizen and later under his father's rule. Titus had been not only criticized, but loathed. He was born on the 30th of December, A.D. 41, the memorial year of Gaius's assassination, in a small, dingy slum bedroom close to the Septizonium, some 7-story building, but not the famous structure of that name, which is much later. End of footnote. The house, which is still standing, is open to the public. He grew up at court with Britannicus, sharing his teachers and following the same curriculum. The story goes that when one day Claudius's freedman Narcissus called in an physiognomus to examine Britannicus's features and prophesy his future, he was told most empathetically that Britannicus would never succeed his father, whereas Titus, who happened to be present, would achieve that distinction. The two boys were such close friends that when Britannicus drank his fatal dose of poison, Titus, who was reclining at the same table, is said to have tasted it as well, and to have been dangerously ill for a long time. He did not forget what had happened, but later set up 2 statues of Britannicus, a golden one to be installed in the palace, and an ivory equestrian one, which is still carried in the circus procession, in which he personally followed around the ring at its dedication. When Titus came of age, the beauty and talents that had distinguished him as a child grew even more remarkable. Though not tall, he was both graceful and dignified, both muscular and handsome, except for a certain punchiness. He had a phenomenal memory and displayed a natural aptitude alike for almost all the arts of war and peace, handled arms and rode a horse with great skill, could compose speeches and verses in Greek or Latin with equal ease, and actually extemporized them on occasions. He was something of a musician, too, sang pleasantly, and had mastered the harp. It often amused him to compete with his secretaries at shorthand writing, or so I have heard, and he claimed that he could imitate any handwriting in existence, and might have been the most celebrated forger of all time. Titus's reputation, while an active and efficient colonel in Germany and Britain, is attested by the numerous inscribed statues and busts found in both countries. After completing his military service, he pleaded in the Roman Forum as a barrister, but in order to make a reputation, not because he meant to make a career of it. The father of his first wife, Aracina Tertulla, was only a Roman knight, but commanded the guards. When she died, Titus married the very well-connected Marcia Fernella, whom he divorced after she had borne him a daughter. When his quaestorship at Rome ended, he went to command one of his father's legions in Judea, and there captured the strongly fortified cities of Tarichae and Gamala. In the course of the fighting, he had a horse killed under him, but mounted another belonging to a comrade who fell at his side. Titus was presently sent to congratulate Galba on his accession, and attracted attention wherever he went because of a general belief that he had been sent for so that the emperor could adopt him. Seeing, however, that the empire was again in a state of confusion, Titus turned back to visit the oracle of Venus at Paphos, to consult it about his voyage, and there heard his own prospects of wearing the purple mentioned again. His hopes were soon confirmed. Footnote, i.e., by the accession of Vespasian to the throne. And he was left to complete the conquest of Judea. In the final assault on Jerusalem, Titus managed to kill 12 of the garrison with successive arrows, and the city was captured on his daughter's birthday. Titus's prowess inspired such deep admiration in the troops that they hailed him as imperator, and on several occasions, when he seemed on the point of relinquishing his command, urged him on with prayers and even threats either to stay or to let them all go with him. Such passionate devotion aroused a suspicion that he planned to revolt from his father and make himself king in the East, especially since he had worn a diadem while attending the consecration of the Apis bull at Memphis on his way to Alexandria. This accorded with ancient ritual, but gave rise to unfavorable interpretations. Because of these, Titus sailed for Italy at once in a naval transport touching the Rhegium and Puteoli. Hurrying on to Rome, he exploded all the false rumors by greeting Vespasian, who had not been expecting him, with the simple words, "Here I am, Father, here I am." He now became his father's colleague, almost his guardian, sharing in the Judean triumph, in the censorship, in the exercise of tribunician power, and in 7 consulships. He bore most of the burdens of government, and, in his father's name, dealt with official correspondence, drafted edicts, and even took over the quaestor's task of reading the imperial speeches to the Senate. Titus also assumed command of the guards, a post which had always before been entrusted to a knight, and in which he behaved somewhat high-handedly and tyrannically. If anyone aroused his suspicion, guards detachments would be sent into theater or camp to demand the man's punishment, as if by the agreement of everyone present, and he would then be executed without delay. Titus disposed of Aulus Caecina, an ex-consul, by inviting him to dinner and having him stabbed almost before he had left the dining room. Yet here he was impelled by a critical situation. The manuscript of a speech which Caecina intended for the troops had fallen into his hands. Actions of this sort, although an insurance against the future, made Titus so deeply disliked at the time that perhaps no more unwelcome claimant to the supreme power has ever won it. He was believed to be profligate as well as cruel, because of the righteous parties which he kept going with his more extravagant friends far into the night, and immoral, too, because he owned a troop of inverts and eunuchs, and nursed a notorious passion for Queen Berenice, to whom he had allegedly promised marriage. He also had a reputation for greed, since it was well known that he was not averse to using influence to settle his father's cases in favor of the highest bidder. It was even thought and prophesied quite openly that he would prove to be a second Nero. However, this pessimistic view stood him in good stead, so soon as everyone realized that here was no monster of vice, but an exceptionally noble character, Public opinion had no fault to find with him. His dinner parties, far from being extravagant, were very pleasant occasions, and the friends he chose were retained in office by his successors as key men in their own service and in natural affairs. He sent Queen Berenice away from Rome, which was painful for both of them, and broke off relations with some of his favorite boys. Though they danced well enough to make a name for themselves on the stage, he never attended their public performances. He never took anything away from any citizen, but showed the greatest respect for private property, and would not even accept the gifts that were permissible and customary. Nor had any of his predecessors ever displayed such generosity. At the dedication of his amphitheatre, footnote, the Flavian Amphitheatre, or Colosseum, end of footnote, At the dedication of his amphitheatre and the baths, which had been hastily built beside it, Titus provided a most lavish gladiatorial show. He also staged a sea fight on the old artificial lake, footnote, the Pneumachia, end of footnote, and when the water had been let out, used the basin for further gladiatorial contests and a wild beast hunt, 5,000 beasts of different sorts, dying in a single day. Titus was naturally kind-hearted, and though no emperor following Tiberius's example had ever consented to ratify individual concessions granted by his predecessor, unless they themselves had conferred the same privileges on the same individuals, Titus did not wait to be asked, but signed a general edict confirming all such concessions whatsoever. He also had a rule never to dismiss any petitioner without leaving him some hope that his request would be favorably considered. Even when warned by his staff how impossible it would be to make good such promises, Titus maintained that no one ought to go away disappointed from an audience with the emperor. One evening at dinner, realizing that he had done nobody any favor throughout the entire day, he spoke these memorial words: "My friends, I have wasted a day." He took such pains to humor his subjects that on one occasion, before a gladiatorial show, he promised to forego his own preferences and let the audience choose what they liked best, and kept his word by refusing no request and encouraging everyone to tell him what each wanted. Yet he openly acknowledged his partisanship of the Thracian gladiators, and would gesture and argue vociferously with the crowd on this subject, though never losing either his dignity or his sense of justice, so as to miss no occasion whatever of courting popularity. Sometimes he would use the new public baths in company with the common people. Titus's reign was marked by a series of dreadful catastrophes: an eruption of Mount Vesuvius in Campania, footnote, the eruption that destroyed Pompeii, Herculaneum, Stabiae, and Oplontis, end of footnote. A fire at Rome which burned for 3 days and nights, and one of the worst outbreaks of plague that had ever been known. Repeating, Titus's reign was marked by a series of dreadful catastrophes: an eruption of Mount Vesuvius in Campania, a fire at Rome which burned for 3 days and nights, and one of the worst outbreaks of plague that had ever been known. Throughout this assortment of disasters, he showed far more than an emperor's concern. It resembled the deep love of a father for his children, which he conveyed not only in a series of comforting edicts, but by helping the victims to the utmost extent of his purse. He set up a board of ex-consuls, chosen by lot, to relieve distress in Campania, and devoted the property of those who had died in the eruption and left no heirs to a fund for rebuilding the stricken cities. His only comment on the fire at Rome was, "This has ruined me." He stripped his own country mansions of their decorations, distributed these among the public buildings and temples, and appointed a body of knights to see that his orders were promptly carried out. Titus attempted to cure the plague and limit its ravages by every imaginable means, human as well as divine, resorting to all sorts of sacrifices and medical remedies. One of the worst features of Roman life at the time was the license long enjoyed by informers and their managers. Titus had these well whipped, clubbed, and then taken to the amphitheater. Again, footnote, the Flavian amphitheater or Colosseum, end of footnote. And paraded in the arena, where some were put up for auction as slaves, and the remainder deported to the most forbidding islands. In further discouragement of any who at any future time might venture on similar practices, he allowed nobody to be tried for the same offense under more than one law, and limited the period during which inquiries could be made into the status of dead people. He had promised before his accession to accept the office of chief priest as a safeguard against committing any crime, and kept his word. Thereafter he was never directly or indirectly responsible for a murder, and although often given abundant excuse for revenge, swore that he would rather die than take life. Titus dismissed, with a caution, 2 patricians convicted of aspiring to the empire. He told them that this was a gift of destiny, and they would be well advised to renounce their hopes. He also promised them whatever else they wanted, and hastily sent messengers to reassure the mother of one of the pair, who lived some distance away, that her son was safe. Then he invited them to dine among his friends, and the next day to sit close by him during the gladiatorial show, where he asked them to take and inspect the blades of the contestants' swords brought for him to look at. Finally, the story goes, he consulted the horoscopes of both men and warned them that dangers threatened, but at some future date and from another person. Quite correctly, as events proved. Titus's brother Domitian took part in endless conspiracies against him, stirred up disaffection in the armed forces almost openly, and toyed with the notion of fleeing to them. Yet Titus had not the heart to execute Domitian, dismiss him from court, or even treat him less honorably than before. Instead, he continued to repeat, as on the first day of his reign, "Remember that you are my partner and chosen successor," and often took Domitian's side, begging him tearfully to return the affection he offered. Death, however, intervened, which was a far greater loss to the world than to Titus himself. At the close of the games he wept publicly, and then set off for Sabine territory, in a gloomy mood, because a victim had escaped when he was about to sacrifice it, and because thunder had sounded from a clear sky. He collapsed with fever at the first posting station, and on his way from the place in a litter, is said to have drawn back the curtains, gazed up at the sky, and complained bitterly that life was being undeservedly taken from him, since only a single sin lay on his conscience. What that was he did not reveal, and it was difficult to guess what he meant, and he did not disclose it at the time. The enigmatic remark has been taken as referring to incest with Domitian's wife, Domitia, though she herself solemnly denied the allegation. Had the charge been true, she would surely never have made any such denial, but boasted of it, as she did of all her other misdeeds. Titus died at the age of 41, in the same country house where Vespasian had also died. It was the 1st of September, A.D. 81, and he had reigned 2 years, 2 months, and 20 days. When the news spread, the entire population went into mourning as though they had suffered a personal loss. Senators hurried to the house without waiting for an official summons, and before the doors had been opened, and then when they were opened, began speaking of him, now that he was dead, with greater thankfulness and praise than they had ever used while he was alive and among them. End of part 11. Titus.